Welcome back. In our last video, Philo had kind of revealed the definitions behind the green grass and the regular grass, and this might not have meant anything to anybody who is not paying attention to their Bibles. But there is something very important here about knowing and understanding the grass. Your entire Bible is an allegory, and all the characteristics found in it are going to be revealed through the different uh, allegories that Philo is explaining. For instance, when he talked about the green grass as opposed to the regular grass, he revealed that the green grass is where rational animals graze, while any kind of grass, crabgrass or whatever, is where irrational animals graze. In other words, one is where garbage feeders dwell, that would be the regular grass, and the other is where rational animals like the cow, the lamb, the sheep, the goat, excuse me, I should not include the goat in that categorization because goats eat garbage, but the sheep, the cow, all the animals that graze on regular grass, the rational animals, the ones who think logically about what they're eating, they symbolize things pertaining to the intellect. So the green grass pertains to the intellect because it's where rational animals are, and the regular grass just symbolizes where external things are. Garbage, like television, movies, books, music, things external that you don't really think about. As we continue now, and I was going to explain why that's important. The reason that's important is, for instance, in Exodus, or not Exodus, excuse me, but in Genesis, Joseph interprets dreams surrounding Pharaoh when he has a dream about 7 years of famine and whatnot. Well, if there's a famine, it's pertaining to the grass, if because that's where your fruits grow. So if there's a famine, it's either going to come upon the green grass, or it's going to come upon regular grass, or it's going to come upon both. So if there's a famine, it would come upon things perceived by the external mind, or it would come upon things perceived by the intellect. As we know, the intellect is beginning to come forth. That means that the famine is upon external things. Everything surrounding things visible to the naked eye, there's a famine coming upon them. That's why it's important. If you go to Revelation, there's also the mention of grass being burnt up. Again, each of these concepts will be used to determine what God was meaning in these different books. That's why it is so important to get Philo's work done. Well, we're over 3 minutes in, so let's get this next portion started, and we pick up at 25, right after Philo had described the irrational animals and the regular grass. For God did not reign upon the earth, and man did not exist to cultivate the earth, speaking in the strictest accordance with natural philosophy. For if God did not shed the perceptions of things subject to them, like rain upon the senses, in that case the mind too would not labor nor employ itself about sensation. For he himself would be unable to effect anything by himself, unless he were to pour forth, like rain or dew, colors upon the sight, and sounds upon the hearing, and flavor on the taste, and on all the other senses, the things proper to produce the requisite effects. But when God begins to rain sensation on the things perceptible by the external senses, then also the mind is perceived to act like the cultivator of fertile soil. But the idea of sensation, which he, speaking figuratively, has called the earth, is in no need of nourishment. But the nourishment of the senses are the particular objects perceptible by the external senses. And these objects are bodies. But an idea is a thing different from bodies. Before, therefore, there existed any individual compound substances, God did not reign upon that idea of sensation to which he gave the name of the earth, and that means that he did not furnish it with any nourishment. For indeed it had altogether no need of any object perceptible by the external senses. But when Moses says, "And man did not exist to cultivate the earth," that means that the idea of intellect did not labor upon the idea of the sensations. For my intellect and yours work up the sensations by means of things perceptible by the external senses. But the idea of mind, as must be the case while there is no individual body connected with it, does not work upon the idea of sensation. For if it did so work, it would of course work by means of objects, perceptible by the external senses. But there is no such object in ideas. But a fountain went up upon the earth, and watered all the face of the earth. He here calls the mind the fountain of the earth, and the sensations he calls the face of the earth, because there is the most suitable place in the whole body for them, with reference to their appropriate energies. A place that nature, which foreknows everything, has assigned to them, and the mind waters the sensations like a fountain, sending appropriate streams over each. See now how all the powers of a living animal depend upon one another like a chain. For as the mind and sensations and the object perceptible by the external sense are three different things, the middle term is sensation, and the mind and the object perceptible by the external sense are the two extremes. But the mind is unable to work, that is to say, to energize according to sensation, unless God reigns upon and irrigates the object perceptible by the external senses. Nor is there any advantage from the object perceptible to the external sense when watered, unless the mind, like a fountain, extending itself as far as the sensation, puts it in motion when it is quiet, and leads it on to a comprehension of the subject, so that the mind and the object perceptible by the external senses are always endeavoring to reciprocate with one another. The one, the being subject to the sensations as a kind of material would be, and the mind stirring up the sensations toward the external object, as a workman would do, in order to create an appetite. For a living animal is superior to that which is not a living animal in 2 points: imagination and appetite. Accordingly, imagination consists in the approach of the external object striking the mind by means of the sensations, and appetite is the brother of imagination, according to the intensive power of the mind, which the mind keeps on the stretch by means of the sensation, and so touches the subject matter and comes over to it, being eager to arrive at and comprehend it. And God created man, taking a lump of clay from the earth, and breathed into his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul. The races of men are twofold, for one is the heavenly man, and the other the earthly man. Now the heavenly man, as being born in the image of God, has no participation in any corruptible or earth-like essence, but the earthly man is made of loose material, which he calls a lump of clay. On which account he says, not that the heavenly man was made, but that he was fashioned according to the image of God. But the earthly man he calls a thing made, and not begotten by the Maker. And we must consider that the man who was formed of earth means the mind which is to be infused into the body, but which has not yet been so infused. And this mind would be really earthly and corruptible, if it were not that God had breathed into it the spirit of genuine life. For then it exists and is no longer made into a soul, and its soul is not inactive and incapable of proper formation, but a really intellectual and living one. For man, says Moses, became a living soul. But someone may ask why God thought an earthbound mind, which was wholly devoted to the body, worthy of divine inspiration, and yet did not treat the one made after his own idea and image in the same manner. In the second place, he may ask, what is the meaning of the expression, breathed into? And thirdly, why he breathed into his face. Fourthly also, why, since he knew the name of the Spirit when he says, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, he now speaks of breath and not of the Spirit. Now in reply to the first question, we must say this one thing. God, being very munificent, gives his good things to all men, even to those who are not perfect, inviting them to a participation and rivalry in virtue, and at the same time displaying his abundant riches, and showing that it is sufficient for those also who will not be greatly benefited by it. And he also shows this in the most evident manner possible in other cases. For when he rains on the sea, and when he raises up fountains in desert places, and waters shallow and rough and unproductive land, making the rivers to overflow with floods, what else is he doing but displaying the great abundance of his riches and of his goodness? This is the cause why he has created no soul in such a condition as to be wholly barren of good, even if the employment of that good be beyond the reach of some people. We must also give a second reason, which is this. Moses wished to represent all the actions of the deity as just. Therefore, a man who had not had a real life breathed into him, but who was ignorant of virtue, when he was chastised for the sins which he had committed, would say that he was punished unjustly, in that it was only through ignorance of what was good that he had erred respecting it, and that he was to blame who had not breathed any proper wisdom into him. And perhaps he will even say that he has absolutely committed no offense whatever, since some people affirm that actions done involuntarily and in ignorance have not the nature of offenses. Now the expression breathed into is equivalent to inspired or gave life to things inanimate. For let us take care that we are never filled with such absurdity as to think that God employs the organs of the mouth or nostrils for the purpose of breathing into anything. For God is not only devoid of peculiar qualities, but he is likewise not of the form of man, and the use of these words shows some more secret mystery of nature. For there must be three things: that which breathes in, that which receives what is breathed in, and that which is breathed in. Now that which breathes in is God, that which receives what is breathed in is the mind, and that which is breathed in is the spirit. What then is collected from these three things? A union of the three takes place, through God extending the power which proceeds from himself through the Spirit, which is the middle term as far as the subject. Why does he do this except that we may thus derive a proper notion of him? Since how could the soul have perceived God, if he had not inspired it and touched it according to his power? For human intellect would not have dared to mount up to such a height as to lay claim to the nature of God, if God himself had not drawn it up to himself as far as it was possible for the mind of man to be drawn up, and if he had not formed it according to those powers which can be comprehended. And God breathed into man's faith both physically and morally. Physically, when he placed the senses in the face, and this portion of the body above all others is vivified and inspired, and morally in this manner, as the face is the dominant portion of the body. So also is the mind the dominant portion of the soul. It is into this alone that God breathes, but the other parts, the sensations, the power of speech, and the power of generation, he does not think worthy of his breath, for they are inferior in power. By what then were these subordinate parts inspired? Beyond all question by the mind. For of the qualities which the mind has received from God, it gives a share to the irrational portions of the soul, so that the mind is vivified by God, and the irrational part of the soul by the mind. For the mind is, as it were, a god to the irrational part of the soul, for which reason Moses did not hesitate to call it the God of Pharaoh. For of all created things, some are created by God and through him, some not indeed by God, but yet through him, and the rest have their existence both by him and through him. At all events, Moses, as he proceeds, says that God planted a paradise, and among the best things is made both by God and through God is the mind. But the irrational part of the soul was made indeed by God, but not through God, but through the reasoning power which bears rule and sovereignty in the soul. And Moses has used the word breath, not spirit, as there is a difference between the two words. For spirit is conceived of according to strength and intensity and power, but breath is a general breath is a gentle and moderate kind of breeze and exhalation. Therefore, the mind, which was created in accordance with the image and idea of God, may be justly said to partake in his spirit. For its reasoning has strength, but that which is derived from matter is only a partaker in a thin and very light air, being as it were a sort of exhalation, such as arises from spices. For they, although they be preserved intact and are not exposed to fire or fumigation, do nevertheless emit a certain fragrance. And God planted a paradise in Eden in the east, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. For he called that divine and heavenly wisdom by many names, and he made it manifest that it had many appellations. For he called it the beginning, and the image, and the sight of God. And now he exhibits the wisdom which is conversant about the things of the earth, as being an imitation of this archetypal wisdom, in the plantation of this paradise. For let not such impiety ever occupy our thoughts, as for us to suppose that God cultivates the land and plants paradises, since if we were to do so, we should be presently raising the question of why he does so. For it could not be that he might provide himself with pleasant places of recreation and pastime, or with amusement. Let not such fabulous nonsense ever enter our minds, for even the whole world would not be a worthy place or habitation for God, since he is a place to himself, and he himself is full of himself, and he himself is sufficient for himself, filling up and surrounding everything else which is deficient in any respect, or deserted, or empty. But he himself is surrounded by nothing else, as being himself one in the universe. God therefore sows and implants terrestrial virtue in the human race, being an imitation and representation of the heavenly virtue. For pitying our race, and seeing that it is exposed to abundant and innumerable evils, he firmly planted terrestrial virtue as an assistant against, and warder off of the diseases of the soul, being, as I have said before, an imitation of the heavenly and archetypal wisdom, which he calls by various names. Now virtue is called a paradise metaphorically, and the appropriate place for the paradise is Eden, and this means luxury, and the most appropriate field for virtue is peace, and ease, and joy, in which real luxury especially consists. Moreover, the plantation of this paradise is represented in the east, for right reason never sets, and is never extinguished, but it is its nature to be always rising. And as I imagine, the rising sun fills the darkness of the air with light, so also does virtue, when it has arisen in the soul, irradiate its mist and dissipate the dense darkness. And there, says Moses, he placed the man whom he had formed. For God being good, and having formed our race for virtue, as his work which was most akin to himself, places the mind in virtue, evidently in order that it, like a good husband, may cultivate and attend to nothing else except virtue. To be continued in the next video.